and welcome. Today we'll be talking about the UK's security challenges and most specifically its nuclear deterrent, which is fast falling into disrepair. I'm your host Bianca Rahimi and this is The Isle. The UK's general election was dominated by Brexit, but tragedies like the second London Bridge attack and the looming threat of another nuclear arms race has thrown the UK government's defence policies into the spotlight. So what are the UK's main concerns? There is growing concern in Westminster that Britain is losing its clout on the world stage and falling behind when it comes to deterrence and defence. As Brexit looms ever closer, the former empire's relationship with Europe, the US and NATO are yet to be redefined and adjusted. And amid this quagmire of allegiance and influence, British military brass warn the world is changing and with it the definitions of peace and war. In January 2018, Britain's army chief warned that the UK's ability to withstand attack and respond to threats was being eroded.
We need to acknowledge that we have some capability issues that have to be addressed. I think first we have to recognise that deterrence needs a set of graduated responses to enable escalation. And that means that for me, as the CGS, it's important that I recapitalise much of the Army's equipment. We need to recognise that credible deterrence must be underpinned by genuine capability and genuine commitment that earns the respect of potential opponents.
In May 2019, the Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt called for increased investment in NATO, further expressing the UK's concerns when it came to rising global powers and the advancement of military technology the whole world is scrambling to compete with.
Without the assurance provided by unquestioned American dominance, we face a more aggressive Russia and a more assertive China. We simply don't know what the balance of power in the world will be in 25 years' time. And at the same time, the nature of warfare is changing. The conflicts of tomorrow could well start with a cyber attack, then escalate into precision strikes by hypersonic missiles, followed by swarms of unmanned aircraft. The new domains of space and cyber and the immense capability of artificial intelligence will transform the conduct of warfare.
After becoming Prime Minister in the general election on December 12, 2019, Prime Minister Boris Johnson dismissed all assertions that NATO was in crisis and reaffirmed the UK's commitment to the North Atlantic Alliance.
70 years old, we are rock solid in our commitment to NATO and to the giant shield of solidarity that now protects 29 countries and nearly 1 billion people. The fact that we live in peace today demonstrates the power of the simple proposition at the heart of this alliance. That for as long as we stand together, no one can hope to defeat us. But history shows that peace cannot be taken for granted. And even as we celebrate this anniversary, we must ensure that our deeds match our words. And the atrocity in London last Friday showed why we must work together to combat terrorism and the vital importance of NATO's missions to counter this threat.
The atrocity Johnson spoke of was the second London Bridge attack that happened on Friday the 29th of November 2019. 5 people were stabbed, 2 fatally. Members of the public intervened first, then the attacker was shot dead by police. Security analyst and former soldier Charles Shoebridge says this kind of attack is what the British public worry about most.
Of course, the United Kingdom, like so many countries, faces threats from a variety of different quarters and at different levels, and some of which, of course, are more likely to occur than others. But I think when you ask most people in the street what their concern would be in the security context, it would be the threat of terrorism. Because we know it's an actual and real threat. It regularly claims lives in the UK, as it does elsewhere. And, of course, it's often in the news. And it's the thing that is most immediately likely to impact on most people. And so when you look at the terror threat, we're talking about particularly two groups at the moment. It could change, of course, but particularly from the far right, but still very much so so-called Islamist-oriented terrorism, extremism such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda or other so-called jihadist-based attempts to kill people, including the general public. And so that's actually the main threat in terms of the immediacy that the UK faces. But of course there are other threats if one looks back through history, which people often do, of course, people who make decisions, that they would say that you have to be prepared for other threats that may eventually arise.
The Prime Minister has consistently supported military action against Daesh. On December 2, 2015, he voted in favour of UK airstrikes against the terrorist organisation in Syria. After the death of Daesh founder Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in October 2019, Johnson said the fight against Daesh was not yet over. At the present time, Syria and Iraq are still grappling with the possible resurgence of Daesh, and Turkey is deporting fighters and their families while trying to secure its borders. Western intervention and blatant interference in these countries, among others, is blamed in large part for the security threats on London streets. Britain, the second largest defence exporter in the world, is accused of being complicit in wars around the world, most notably the Saudi war on Yemen that has caused the worst humanitarian crisis of our times.
If we stop selling them the bombs, if we stop selling them the planes, that will have an impact on Saudi and on what Saudi can do in Yemen, because we are one of the main exporters of arms to Saudi Arabia, and frankly we can't make bombs fast enough for them. So it'll be a big blow, of course it will be. But, you know, we've been friends with Saudi Arabia for a long time. We will always be friends with Saudi Arabia, but we have to be really good friends, which means friends tell the truth. You don't pull your punches, and you make it clear that what they have been doing in Yemen has been wrong, continues to be wrong, and we will no longer give them the arms to do it.
Experts say the UK-backed wars on Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria have fueled extremism, and what goes around comes around. In the new Tory government's manifesto, they said they will not be cutting the military in any form. The UK is the second biggest overall spender in NATO, putting nearly £50 billion into defence annually. In 2018, the MOD committed to spending £179.6 billion on its equipment plan over the next 10 years, £165 million on its cyber plan, and £50 million on a 5-year space programme. And the new Conservative government has vowed to further bolster the British military. Funding will be increased by 2.6%. That's the equivalent of £2.2 billion. The UK will continue to exceed the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on defence. And the UK will renew Trident, the UK's nuclear deterrent. Since 1969, a British submarine carrying nuclear weapons has been gliding silently beneath the waves somewhere in the world's oceans. The Trident has been the UK's nuclear deterrent since the 1980s. It is unique in the fact that it operates not from land, but out of a single deep-water naval base. 4 Vanguard-class nuclear submarines carry the US-made Trident ballistic missiles that give the weapons system its collective name. Each one has the capacity to deliver up to 12 thermonuclear warheads. According to the BBC, each missile has a range of up to 7,500 miles and has a destructive power, the equivalent of 8 Hiroshimas. One submarine is always on patrol, ensuring a continuous at-sea deterrence. The theory is that if the UK is attacked, it can launch a catastrophic retaliatory strike, something that is known as mutually assured destruction. Supporters of replacement say that terrorist groups and rogue states might attack at any time, so maintaining a minimum nuclear deterrent is necessary. Trident will be approaching the end of its lifespan in the late 2020s, so if it is to be renewed, work must start without delay. Replacing the 4 submarines alone will take at least 17 years. The whole project will cost more than £200 billion from start to finish. Security experts say the UK is prepared to fork out that much to stay relevant.
If one looks back through history, which people often do, of course, people who make decisions, that they would say that you have to be prepared for other threats that may eventually arise. So, for example, if we look back to the 1930s, where Britain went through quite a sustained period of disarmament, only then to be faced quite rapidly with a massive build-up of resources being devoted to the German Nazi war machine, as it was. Of course, it became quite difficult for Britain, and indeed other countries, Russia's another example, Soviet Union as it was, to quickly put in place the measures and the equipment and the training and the volume of forces and equipment that you need to counter that. And so, therefore, there has to be an element of the armed forces, and that of course includes its nuclear deterrent as well, or nuclear forces, as an insurance policy, to be able to protect the nation and its interests if something evolves in the future that may not be able to be predicted. Now, in Britain's case, there's another aspect to this, of course, and Britain isn't alone in this. Other countries such as France, the United States, also follow this path in that they believe that their forces, not just the material, but the men and women who serve in those forces, shouldn't just be used for defending the country and its interests, but also should be used as a tool of foreign policy to project power. You often hear British politicians, British journalists, and particularly senior soldiers and naval personnel, for example, using this term projecting power. And of course what they mean by that is attacking countries that, or threatening to attack countries to exert, for example, diplomatic leverage. It's a very, when one looks in historical context, it's a very colonial perhaps mindset that you can use your armed forces to actually pressure, blackmail, if you like, other countries into doing, or perhaps not doing, what you want them to do or not want them to do, rather than defending the country.
In 2016, Parliament convened ahead of a vote to support replacing the 4 Trident nuclear missile submarines. Meanwhile, thousands protested outside, demanding the UK scrap its nuclear arsenal and end its continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent.
There's absolutely no reason for Britain to have nuclear weapons. If you look at the threats that we're facing in terms of, as the military and the government themselves say, these threats do not lie in nuclear war, and yet we're told that maybe in 30 years' time we'll have to have nuclear weapons just in case there's going to be a nuclear war. It's absolutely mad.
It is simply an excuse by the people who run this country to try and retain their membership of a select and privileged club in this world. That's what it's about. People who can't get over the fact that we are no longer the British Empire, that we need to have a new role in the world that is not built on being a nuclear power, but being a crusader for peace throughout the world.
Meanwhile, inside, Defence Secretary of the time, Michael Fallon, was telling MPs nuclear threats were growing around the world and Trident, quote, puts doubt in the minds of our adversaries. And ultimately, an overwhelming majority voted to renew Trident. The Labour Party was split over the issue, with 140 of its 230 MPs going against leader Jeremy Corbyn and backing the motion. A total of 47 Labour members voted against renewal, while others abstained. Andrea Berger of the James Martin Centre for Non-Proliferation Studies says those who object to nuclear weapons on ethical grounds say the UK should never be a country that is willing to threaten or use nuclear weapons against an adversary, even in the most extreme circumstances, and that the humanitarian consequences of doing that will be so grotesque as to be unfathomable. But what about those who assert having nuclear weapons ensures they won't ever be used?
You've got a situation where it's not just that it's considered important militarily. After all, if we think about the nuclear deterrent, it's usually termed the nuclear deterrent because it's not envisaged, I think, in any way that it would be used actually just to attack a country that hadn't already attacked the UK. If therefore it's ever going to be used, it has already failed in its purpose, because if it's used, therefore a nuclear attack has presumably already taken place. But it has another function that is, I think, in the minds of the politicians and the military people who advocate it. And that is that it, if you like, gives Britain that in so many ways isn't a member of this club, but the fact that it owns nuclear weapons makes it a member of what they would like to think of the big boys club on the international stage.
As a confirmed unilateralist with a general scepticism towards the use of military force, and chairman of the Stop the War coalition, Jeremy Corbyn, who opposed the Iraq War, insists there are no circumstances in which he would press the nuclear button. In 2017, as UK Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson made his sentiments regarding Corbyn's stance and Trident very clear.
A guy who sends out a signal to all would-be terrorists that he disapproves of shoot to kill, even when those terrorists are threatening unarmed civilians. A guy who preemptively informs any power that wishes to engage in nuclear blackmail that, as our Prime Minister, he, Corbyn, would not, under any circumstances, deploy Trident, so making a nonsense of our nuclear deterrent.
Time is ticking for Trident, though. The current generation of 4 submarines will begin to end their working lives in the late 2020s. The new submarines alone could take 17 years to develop, so if Trident is to be replaced, work must begin without delay. And it's more than likely the UK will go ahead with plans to do so. The US and Russia own 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. The UK holds about 1.4% of the world's nuclear warheads, which is the smallest share of any stockpile of nuclear warheads among countries recognised under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The UK fears giving up on its nuclear arsenal will mean the loss of its clout on the global scene.
After all, why is a country like Britain on the Security Council? Why, when countries like India are not? Britain doesn't have a huge population. It's declining in terms of its economic importance. It's obviously a vestige of colonial days that Britain still, and countries like France, still have these seats whereby they purport to govern or dictate largely what the rest of the world should subscribe or ascribe to. And one of the arguments put forward is that, for example, because Britain is a nuclear power, therefore it should be keeping its seat on the Security Council. In other words, that is one example of where the fact that Britain has nuclear weapons is used as a way of increasing, shall we say, the diplomatic clout of the United Kingdom, notwithstanding that actually there's no direct relevance or relationship between the diplomatic clout and, for example, having those nuclear weapons.
And the evidence does suggest that having nuclear arms is a major bargaining chip for all who possess them. India, Israel, North Korea and Pakistan never signed the NPT and possess nuclear arsenals. All these countries are given a wide berth when it comes to any kind of confrontation.
The moment that North Korea got nuclear weapons, really Trump is on the plane over to go and see him. Not even and having conferences and so on. So you're immediately elevated to the top table. And this isn't even to criticise Trump for doing that, because he's trying to seek a resolution to the problem, as well as, of course, getting another feather in his cap. But that wouldn't have happened if North Korea was not a nuclear power. And so the unfortunate fact is that it does elevate you to a unique position. A big boys club where you carry more clout despite the fact that you are economically and, if you like, politically relatively weak.
And there are some countries that are suspected of having nuclear weapons or working towards the development of such weapons. Dubai is set to become the first country in the Arabian Peninsula to have a nuclear power plant. A leading nuclear scientist has claimed this could spark a nuclear arms race in the Middle East and leave the Persian Gulf at risk of a Chernobyl-style disaster. Saudi Arabia has made steps towards a nuclear program as well, and according to some observations, they can be used to develop nuclear weapons. Iran is also accused of having a secret nuclear weapons program, although the leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Khamenei, has firmly denounced nuclear weapons on moral grounds. But if a column Boris Johnson wrote for The Telegraph is anything to go by, the Prime Minister of Britain would totally sympathise with Tehran if it did pursue nuclear weapons. These sentiments, expressed so vehemently back in 2006, are a clear indicator of why a Conservative government led by Boris Johnson will be maintaining and renewing its nuclear arsenal. Another aspect of the UK's nuclear deterrent is the 30,000 jobs it supports. The predictions are that the scrapping of Trident would devastate the economies of Plymouth, Devonport and elsewhere in southwest England, parts of the UK which are already among the poorest, with no prospect of skilled, well-paid jobs to compensate for the ones lost in submarine construction and refitting. And as Trident is based in HMNB Clyde on the west coast of Scotland, critics say getting rid of it would risk the livelihoods of 6,800 service personnel and civilian staff, and an estimated 5,000 extra jobs linked to the base. That said, Scotland's ruling SNP party, which has been calling for independence from Westminster for decades now, says Trident must go. But is the UK's nuclear deterrent independent? Critics argue it isn't. Britain is technically dependent on the US. For example, the British Trident missiles are serviced at a port in Georgia, in the US, and some warheads components are also made in America.
The problem is going forward is that when you've got a situation where, in the United Kingdom's case, where you've got a divergence away from Europe because of Brexit, a divergence possibly in the future away from the United States, because it's difficult to predict with Trump's foreign policy the extent to which he perhaps would want American forces to protect the United Kingdom. The likelihood is that the geopolitical situation of the United Kingdom at the moment and going forward is, regardless of the objective facts and logic involved, it's far more likely, I think, that the argument will be made that in this post-Brexit, perhaps even post-NATO world, that Britain will need its nuclear deterrent more than ever. The irony is that that will give Britain actually probably less clout in the world, because it will reduce its so-called power projection capability, which is what defence chiefs and political chiefs like to have their forces for. It's important again and again, the United Kingdom, perhaps as this post-colonial power that has this mindset that says that its military, its primary military function, or the primary function of its military doesn't appear to be to defend the country. It is to either, the far more nebulous, defend its interests, which means that it's intervening in everywhere around the world, or to project power for the British government, and that means effectively attacking or threatening to attack other countries.
On a domestic level, there are many pressing concerns within the UK, with the country's underfunded healthcare system limping into an uncertain future, and cuts to social welfare and the education system, leaving many people without jobs and basic services. Despite the challenges on the ground, Brexit is looming, threatening the breakup of the empire and isolation from Europe. So it's very unlikely that Westminster is going to jeopardise its seat at the big boys' table. I'm Bianca Rahimi, and you've been watching The Isle.